Hello there, are you able to hear me all right?
How you doing?
Thank you very much, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Pretty good, thank you.
Excellent. I wanted to speak about a few points with you. In essence, I believe in the exact same holding as those that preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I was looking to talk about a few points with you, and particularly to begin, in regards to God not being a man or anything of that nature. Rome actually had the custom of deifying people such as they did Vespasian after his death, and also Titus after his death, shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And about 30 years later after that, you have the first mentions of a Roman Catholic Church. So I first wanted to bring that up to you to see if you see any connection there whatsoever, that here you have these two people who were deified by Rome after their deaths, and then you have the first mentions of a Catholic Church by Ignatius circa 30 years later.
No.
Now you'll have to decide for yourselves if you're still going to refer to this kid as logic after this. However, it doesn't take a Sherlock Holmes or any super detective or anything of that nature to put together that you see a Roman custom of deifying whom were their leaders. And then around 30 years later, you have the first documented mentions of a Catholic Church. Your common sense, or in other words, logic, should really be kicking in about now.
Okay, now in regards to a virgin birth, this contradicts Jeremiah 33:17 that states that
We're not talking about the virgin birth, brother. We're talking about the deity of Christ.
Now, as you see here, to act as if I just switched the subject altogether is simply completely asinine.
So you're saying that the Old Testament has no link with God taking on a human form, coming in the flesh?
correct.
You said that you line up with the scrolls that are found at the Dead Sea?
Correct.
All right. So can you go ahead and you're familiar with Isaiah 9:6, right?
I am.
Does it say that son to be born is identified as the mighty God and eternal Father?
First, to address that he stated the son to be born.
Does it say that son to be born?
And you will see that in the original Hebrew, this verse is written in the perfect tense, which indicates a completed action, or in other words, something that already happened. And here we will see actual biblical translations in that correct format.
Every single Christian Bible does this. There are some that do this that are honest about this, but they're not the fundamentalist Bibles. But if you open a King James, you open an NIV, wow, it'll say then Vayikra Shemai, and his name shall be called. And then we go through, we have a whole series of names of what names this child will one day be called. If you spend 16 minutes with a Christian missionary, this is going to come up. And the argument is that this proves definitively, this is an unassailable proof that the divinity of the Mashiach, God forbid, is foretold by the prophet Isaiah. Got it? Okay, good. Now, you're going, what's going on here? All the verbs in this passage have been changed from what's called the perfect tense into the future tense. That's how this was done, which means that if we're going to go through the Hebrew in a moment, and I'm going to teach you, if you're a Christian, a lot is at stake. I'm going to show you how you can check it out yourself, because it's very important to me that you don't take my word for it. That's how Jews are. We don't want you to take a word for it. We want you to look it up yourself. But you say, Rabbi, how am I going to look it up? I don't know Hebrew, so I'm going to show you how to do it, because someone's not telling the truth. So let's first see what the text says. The text, Ki Yeled Yulad Lanu, every Hebrew speaker knows that what the New International Version says is a lie. The word Yulad does not mean will be born, for a child will be born. No. The word Yulad is in the perfect tense, or I'll just use a conventional term, is in the past tense. In Semitic languages, we typically use the perfect tense. That means it happened already. So what the Christian Bible did is it took the word Ki Yelad Lanu. It's talking about an event that already occurred, not an event that's going to happen 700 years later.
Does it say that son to be born?
It's talking about an event that already occurred, not an event that's going to happen 700 years later.
So now that it is completely clear that his entire premise was wrong when it came to the book, chapter, and verse that he himself wanted to bring up, now we will continue with the conversation.
There were lots of Hebrews named after God in different ways. That doesn't mean that they were God themselves. And particularly when one goes through Isaiah, you're talking about the exile which took place.
Yeah, none of them are actually called God or anything like that. They'll have names like God is salvation, or God is redemption, or God sees me, or stuff like that. God's house. They'll have God's messenger. They'll have names like that, but none of them are called God. Like in Isaiah 9:6, the person is identified as the mighty God, and he's also identified as the everlasting Father.
That's still trying to twist the interpretations to fit in a Christology which none of those Hebrews actually believed in. In fact, the reason why I just simply moved on to the virgin birth, because you answered my question in regards to you yourself saw no connection in regards to Rome deifying their people in the way that they did, and then 30 years later you have the mention of a Catholic Church which in essence deifies a man. That's the reason I moved on to the virgin birth. You simply told me you felt there was no connection there. That's fine. But
yeah, you're simply talking about the Old Testament. You're saying that I'm twisting the interpretation, but I didn't twist anything. I just quoted the verses. It says that the son to be born, the child given, will be called the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Father of Eternity, and the Prince of Peace. I'm not interpreting that. That's just what it blatantly says. So he's literally called the Mighty God and Eternal Father.
Now you will find no shortage of scholars that explain exactly what I just did with regards to Hebrews naming their children after God in the ways in which they did. Of course, at no point confusing their child for God itself. Here you have even more scholars speaking of this verse in particularly, which are stating the exact same, particularly with regards to King Hezekiah. As I was explaining earlier, the book of Isaiah goes over the Babylonian exile which was to come, and in the place and time of the verse of Isaiah 9:5 in the Hebrew Bible, 9:6 in different translations, King Hezekiah was the king at the time. Of course, feel free to pause to read through these scholarly reviews that reaffirm exactly as I just stated. Now, on top of some translations actually referring to those attributes of God to God itself, and then Prince of Peace to King Hezekiah, there is the very meaning of King Hezekiah's name. Now, though Mighty God is often translated as El Gibor, further proof that this text is referring to King Hezekiah is the fact that the Mighty God is also translated from his very name. Again, as I was explaining from the very beginning, Hebrews named their children after God itself.
Are huge. What name you are called, what name you are given. It's just a huge topic, but it's, again, I'm not going to get into this show why. But the key is, many names are ascribed to him. Now, at first glance, they look like divine names, and they are. But people go, oh, he's called, let's just take the most notable, because just for time, he's called the Mighty God. People are like, Mighty God, who's given such a name? Well, names in scriptures, almost always, Jewish names, names of kings, are almost always divine names. It doesn't mean they're divine. It means that these are people who represented, who were agents, who were proper messengers of God. The name Hezekiah, or Chizkiyahu, HaMelech, which means the king. Okay, the word Melech means king, both in Jewish, actually, is the same in Arabic. But you know what Chizkiyahu means? You know what Hezekiah means? It means, look it up, Google it, I don't know, wherever you get your information, look up. It means the Mighty God. His name, Chizkiyahu, literally means, Chazak means mighty, Yahu, God. So that's the answer to your question. The church changed the text. All you do is search all these words. Yulad, Vatihi, Vayikra. Just search everywhere in the Bible.
None of them are actually called God or anything like that. They'll have names like God is salvation, or God is redemption, or God sees me, or stuff like that. God's house. They'll have God's messenger. They'll have names like that, but none of them are called God. Like in Isaiah 9:6, the person is identified as the mighty God.
His name, Chesio, literally means, Chazak means mighty, Yahu, God.
I see. Now, according to your paradigm, was this mighty God that you're mentioning, it was born once thus far, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, then why is it in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 14, it states, Yahweh your God walks in the middle of your camp? So very clearly, there is a distinction in regards to how the Hebrews actually saw God expressing itself throughout all creation, literally.
I disagree, because what you're demonstrating is that throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's a plurality within Yahweh's essence. So Yahweh dwelling in the midst of Israel and walking amongst them really was the angel of the Lord that it says in Exodus that was there, who's also called Yahweh, and says that he is the God of Bethel that Jacob met, right? That Jacob made a vow to. So that angel of the Lord, who's a messenger of Yahweh, who also shares in the same nature as Yahweh, is the one who is hands-on with Israel.
Now at best, he was just trying to refer to Exodus chapter 3, which states that Yahweh's angel appeared to him being Moses, in a flame of fire out of the middle of a bush. Then it goes on to say, when Yahweh saw that he came over to see, God called to him out of the middle of the bush. Very clearly, God is using one of its angels as one of its agents, as we just read here, Yahweh's angel, and then Yahweh saw, just as in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 3, the eyes of the Lord are everywhere. So as we see very clearly here, this does not mean that it is God itself, but an angel, of course, working on behalf of God. Once more, this is through a burning bush, as I stated before, God expressing itself through creation. Then it goes on to say, to Moses, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now I brought up Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 14, which states, for Yahweh your God walks in the middle of your camp. Now you'll notice, though there are no orders here to remove any sandals, still there is the order to, of course, bury one's excrements in order to keep the camp holy. So let's see if this is a situation which is parallel to Yahweh's angel speaking to Moses through a burning bush, or if this actually represents God taking on flesh, human form, and walking around as this person tries to contend.
So you're saying that the Old Testament has no link with God taking on a human form, coming in the flesh?
Now we see in Numbers chapter 12 a situation where God comes down in a pillar of cloud. And then it says, and God stood. Of course, it doesn't take much logic to ask yourself if a pillar of cloud can stand. So once more, we have here another instance of God expressing itself through creation. We also see that God, Yahweh, represented itself in this form, not just with Moses throughout the meetings in the desert, but also after the building of the first temple. As we see here, it is recorded that when the first temple was built, a dark cloud filled the temple. And then Solomon goes on to state, the Lord has said, that he would dwell in a dark cloud. And as we see in Exodus chapter 19 as well as chapter 24, Yahweh appeared to Moses in a thick cloud. And being outside of the temple, we see that the cloud is a part of thunder and lightning. And upon close review is directly aligned with a translation of Genesis chapter 3 verse 8. Then the man and his wife heard the thunder of Yahweh God going back and forth in the garden in the wind of the storm, and they hid from Yahweh among the trees of the garden. This speaking of Adam and Eve. As here we see a direct connection with the presence of God coming in the form of lightning, thunder, storm, which of course brings on clouds. Now let's see if Moses himself confused this angel of the Lord for Yahweh itself.
Throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's a plurality within Yahweh's essence. So Yahweh dwelling in the midst of Israel and walking amongst them really was the angel of the Lord that it says in Exodus that was there, who's also called Yahweh, and says that he is the God of Bethel that Jacob met, right? That Jacob made a vow to. So that angel of the Lord, who's a messenger of Yahweh, who also shares in the same nature as Yahweh, is the one who is hands-on with Israel.
Now to begin at Exodus chapter 23 verses 20 through 23, it reads, "See, I being Yahweh, God itself, am sending an angel ahead of you." Already, of course, there is a distinction between Yahweh, God, and the angel. Then it goes on to read, "My name is in him," again representing agency of God itself. And then clarifying even further, verse 23 begins, "My angel will go ahead of you." Of course, this meaning God's angel will go ahead of you. Yahweh's angel, just as in Exodus 3 verse 2. So now that we see clearly this is Yahweh's angel, not Yahweh itself, let's see what Moses knew. So once more, we saw in Exodus chapter 23 verses 20 through 23, clearly there is a difference between Yahweh and the angel. So here we're going to see that Moses knew the difference between the angel Yahweh was speaking of sending ahead of them and Yahweh itself. In Exodus chapter 33, beginning at verse 12, it reads, "Moses said to Yahweh, Behold, you tell me, bring up this people, and you haven't let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me your way now, that I may know you, so that I may find favor in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest.
So Yahweh dwelling in the midst of Israel and walking amongst them really was the angel of the Lord.
Once more, making very clear the difference between the angel and the presence of Yahweh. As Moses goes on to state in verse 15, Moses said to it, if your presence doesn't go with me, don't carry us up from here. Now, though of course I encourage you to read through the entire text, when it comes to God taking on flesh and walking around and people seeing it and thoughts of that nature, we'll go down to verse 20 where it reads, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. Further demonstrating that scriptures such as in Numbers chapter 23 verse 19, Hosea chapter 11 verse 9, and 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 29, which state God is not a man, it is not a human being, does mean exactly that. And those who try to twist that it's speaking of in particularly that it does not lie, and that is the emphasis of the text, literally are trying to twist and interpret something to fit as they would like it to, which once more very clearly the actual Hebrews whom lived throughout the times that we are reading of did not believe in whatsoever. To think that one person is God itself is a pagan concept, such as, for example, as Egypt would think of their Pharaoh. People are indeed God's angels. We're going to see further proof of that here shortly, but can also be referred to as Elohim, just as in these examples shown here, which ultimately make clear we are the sons and daughters of God itself, but not God itself. As of course, God would never thirst, let alone have to ask somebody for water, nor obviously be able to be killed by a human being that it ultimately created. That is nonsense. So thus far, this person was incorrect with regards to the formation and structure of Isaiah 9:6, as it is originally in the perfect tense. He was also wrong in his application of the mighty God.
His name, Chesio, literally means, Chazak means mighty, Yahu, God.
And he was also wrong about the angel of the Lord, in essence being Yahweh itself. Once more, making very clear the difference between the angel and the presence of Yahweh.
We see here in Isaiah 9:6, again, we see that God, the mighty God, and the Father of eternity, says that he's going to be born and come in the form of a boy.
Here we see an example of a person whom is currently on the same side, if you will, of the one who I'm engaging with in this sharing, whom is more experienced than him when it comes to these subject matters, still in trying to argue for a prophetic tense fitting into the verse in question, still had to show interpretations from the Talmud, which reflected rabbinic interpretations, showing that once more this is referring to King Hezekiah, who once more was already born, and thus the perfect tense, as names such as Wonderful Counselor came in contrast to how his father Ahaz before him was.
Which we see here in Isaiah 9:6. Again, we see that God, the mighty God, and the Father of eternity, says that he's going to be born and come in the form of a boy.
There's a few things here, Angel. The first thing is that you just mentioned to me that the quote mighty God you were waiting on was to be born once, and then we're talking about different angels such as he who wrestled with Jacob, which of course was a human being such as you and I. You'll see throughout the text, such as in Genesis 18, there were 3 men that visited Abraham, and then in chapter 19, in the first verse, they're introduced as angels. And according to the Jubilees creation,
only two of them are introduced as angels.
That's correct. But according to the Jubilees creation fragment 4Q216, you will see very clearly that, of course, angel means messenger, but in the way that it is commonly placed, you will see that throughout creation, such as let us make man in our image, it's God actually speaking to us in angel form.
Now first we're going to address the fact that some people are under the misconception that one of these angels were God itself, including, as you see here in a comment, someone stating that particularly for whatever reason that the middle one was God. And because of the fact that our friend here stated that only 2 of them were then introduced as angels in the first verse of chapter 19, as you hear here.
Only 2 of them. Only 2 of them are introduced as angels.
In case he's meaning that same exact nonsense by that statement, we're going to go ahead and address this thoroughly. Throughout the chapters concerning Abraham in Genesis, you will continuously see that God comes to Abraham in various ways. As in chapter 15, it states, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. In chapter 17, it states, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, yet doesn't state how it appeared. In chapter 18, it states the Lord appeared to Abraham. Once more, one is actually having to understand how deep Abraham was, that he understood that God expresses itself throughout all of creation, and that everything is ultimately from God, Yahweh. But once more, just as the instances with Moses, which came of course years after him, they did not mistake a human being for God itself. Furthermore, because it states that Abraham referred to the angels that visited them as Lord, that people seem to have that confused with God itself. All you have to do is continue reading, and you will see then that Sarah refers to Abraham as my Lord. You will see in verse 12, it states, Sarah speaking, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, of course referring to Abraham. Very basically and straightforward, just like was derived in Old English and also later Middle English, referring to someone as my Lord was simply addressing someone with respect. It didn't mean they thought the person they were speaking to was God itself. Further clarification is found when analyzing Psalms chapter 110, verse 1, where it states, Yahweh said to my Lord. Yet translated, it reads, the Lord says to my Lord. In any and all cases, clearly showing that David was also referred to as my Lord, yet of course was not Yahweh.
That the Lord, that means Hashem, God, said to my master, meaning King David.
As you see here, there are a list of well over 100 instances where the term Lord is used, not referring to God itself. And in fact, in Genesis chapter 24, you will see multiple instances where it is recorded that the Hittites referred to Abraham as my Lord, also stating that he is a prince of God. In no way, once more in this text, does it state that Abraham is God itself. Furthermore, for anyone thinking, but it said in chapter 18 that Abraham bowed to those angels, you will see here, in respect, Abraham also, quote, bowed to these Hittites, once more in a gesture of respect, as one may see today, for example, in Japan or China. And with regards to chapter 18 of Genesis, stating that there were 3 men, and then chapter 19 only mentioning 2 of those angels. Once more, chapter 19 referred to 2 of them going into the gate of Sodom. It does not mean that the 3rd angel did not go to Gomorrah, as it was still both Sodom and Gomorrah. And there are those that seem to have been confused when it comes to Genesis 19 verse 24, thinking that it refers to 2 Yahwehs, 2 Lords, one on earth and one in heaven. However, just as the case in Genesis 18, it is clearly the style, the structure of the composition. As it reads, then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham? And as you continue reading, for I have chosen him. And then further on, it begins to say, to keep the way of the Lord, and so that the Lord will. And in verse 20, it only becomes all the more evident as the verse begins, Yahweh said. And as we continue reading, verse 21 begins, I will go down. And then verse 22 stating, the men turned from there and went towards Sodom. Once more making very clear, this is portraying that in general, all is from Yahweh. As we saw, Yahweh said in verse 21, I will go down. In verse 22, it is the men who went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before Yahweh. As ultimately all of this was the will of Yahweh. It is indeed also recorded in the Talmud that this is due to the style, the structure of the composition, and citing in comparison a verse of Lamech speaking to his wives. And in 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 18 and 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 21, we also see a similar structure, which is also compared to Genesis 19 verse 24, and ultimately further proving that this is an expression that all comes from Yahweh is the work of Dr. Christian David Ginsburg in his work on the Masorah, where it is clear that Genesis chapter 19 verse 18 held that Lot referred to the two angels in Sodom as Yahweh once more, just as the instance with Abraham, expressing that all comes from Yahweh. And to place it very plainly, in verse 27, where it states that Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he had stood before Yahweh, once more, just as the instance in Numbers with Moses, does a cloud stand? In contrast, just because it states that Abraham stood before Yahweh does not mean that those three angels were God itself, as once more they were angels, agents, messengers of God. Now, with that being further clarified, here we will return back to the conversation.
Again, that's fragment 4Q216, which again supports the fact that there are actual... Go ahead.
That's false. The scripture doesn't say that.
Which scripture are you referring to?
I'm talking about Genesis chapter 1 verse 26. It doesn't say that. There's no Hebrew text that says that God is speaking to humans when he's making humans.
One moment. What I was referring to, Logic, is the fragment 4Q216 aligns with those 6 days of creation, showing that God was indeed speaking to us in angel form.
Not Genesis, right?
It is indeed in Genesis, throughout the days of creation, like when it states, let us make man.
I'm asking a direct question.
What was that?
Does Genesis 1:26 say that God is talking to mankind as he's creating mankind?
No, what I stated was the Jubilees creation fragment 4Q216 makes that clear.
I don't care about that. I don't care about what the actual Bible says, the Hebrew text, the Torah. So in the Torah, it says that God is creating mankind. So when he's creating man, that means that man is not there yet, correct?
Hold on now. I've heard you on various lives, bring up the Dead Sea Scrolls. So are we now just simply picking and choosing what you feel aligns with you? And as I stated before, what actually...
Did you know that there are among the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not biblical? Like poems and stuff?
Now, just as you heard, he just said in the scrolls, there are non-biblical scrolls, such as poems. Now, when you look at the book of Psalms, there is a vast amount of scholars which hold the book of Psalms as poetry, as ultimately the book of Psalms are songs written by King David and also different members of his court to be sung by the Levites in the temple that was ultimately to be built by Solomon.
In the book of Psalms that had been found in Qumran, entirely different genre, Psalms. In the extra Psalms, those which are not known to us in the Bible.
Among the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not biblical?
Those which are not known to us in the Bible. In the Psalm scrolls which is presented in the shrine of the book, in column 27 we are told that David king of Israel, the one who had been described as wise and as poetically gifted,
Poems and stuff.
and as a prophet, according to this scroll, had authored 364 daily songs for each day of the year. He further had authored 52 sacred songs for every one of the Sabbaths of the years. He further authored 18 special songs for the holidays of the year.
It is also a fact that Hannah's prayer, found in 1 Samuel chapter 2, beginning at verse 1, is also considered a poem. In fact, the books in the Bible, the Tanakh, that are a part of the Ketuvim, as you see, as part of an encyclopedia, some of the books in the Ketuvim are considered secular love poems. Of course, by this encyclopedia. And plenty of scholarly work, book by book, showing how indeed books of the Ketuvim are indeed considered poetry, of course is quite easily found should you wish to delve deeper into the subject. However, poetic structure and deep poetic representation is found throughout the Bible. There is also deep poetic structure within the composition of the scriptures themselves, such as in Psalm 23, "For thou art with me," is flanked by 26 words on each side, of course placing emphasis on what all may be around you, though it may seem chaotic. Of course, there is nothing outside of the order of God, and within and through it all, thou art with me. There is also deep poetic structure within gematria, the infusion of letter and number, an original Hebrew trait. Now focusing further on the subject of gematria, as we saw further proof of earlier, it is indeed an original Hebrew trait and has been studied, let alone respected, by some of the most prominent minds in our history. Just as the 6 days of creation, upon closer reflection, show order, let alone mathematical structure, such as the mathematical constants serving as infrastructure to our universe, as does mathematical structure apply to our original script. Miraculous alignment and display of God's divine order and providence through us, its angels, we see that the tree of life, which was all the more out of reach after the interaction with the serpent and eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is referenced 7 times in the Tanakh, 3 times in the book of Genesis, and 4 times in the book of Proverbs. Order of 3 and 4 is also the structure of the 4-letter Hebrew name of God, Yahweh. 3 letters, 4 places, Yud-He, Vav-He, further signature of God itself. And with the Hebrew alphabet intertwining, infusing letter and numbers, the way that the tree of life and the verse therein is spelled out initially, that mathematical equivalent, that gematria, is equal to the gematria of every way it is spelled out throughout those 7 times.
There's a very beautiful phenomenon that I don't believe that we ever spoke about in relation to the 7 species, that the phrase tree of life appears 7 times in the Tanakh, in the Bible. So that's a very clear allusion that the tree of life has 7 aspects or 7 manifestations, which are the origin of the seven fruits of Eretz Yisrael. In the beginning of creation, so there were 2 trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And it says, "Ve'etz ha'chaim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra." So that the tree of life was situated in the very middle point of the garden, and as well was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But once more the verse reads, "Ve'etz ha'chaim b'toch hagan." It's the tochiyut, the inner essence of the garden was the tree of life. So we'll conclude this simply with a very amazing gematria, that the initial phrase, which is before the sin, because we want to get to the tree of life. Tu B'Shvat, this holiday of Tu B'Shvat, is returning, even though Hashem put the angels and the sword in the way of the Shmoret Derech Etz HaChaim, that we shouldn't be able to approach and enter the Garden of Eden and eat the tree of fruit, the tree of life. But through the Torah, and especially through the Pnimiyut Torah, the inner dimension of the Torah, we do believe that we're going to Techav Miad Mamash reach the tree of life and eat from the tree of life. That's Mashiach and the Torah that He will teach us. So we want the tree of life. So we want to return to that pristine, primordial state of Ve'etz ha'chaim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra, that it's all good. The first verse is before the sin. All the others are after. That first verse, once more it reads, Ve'etz ha'chaim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra, that the tree of life is in the midst of it's the middle point. We speak and learn a lot about the meaning of the middle point. We said that there's an allusion here to Chava, to Eve. Eve is called the middle point of man. The woman is the middle point. So it says that the Eitz HaChaim is in the midst of the garden, together with the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. That whole phrase, if you calculate its gematria, the number is 1663. If I would add 1 to it, which is called the Kolel, I would get 2 times the Eretz Yisrael, 64 times Havaya. So at first glance, that's what I thought maybe is the significance of this number, but it's a second observation, the Torah is exact. It doesn't need for me to add the Kolel, because that number 1663, afterwards, if I add together all of the 7 times that the phrase appears throughout the Tanakh, exactly the way it's written in the Tanakh and the Bible. The first one is Ve'etz HaChaim, the second one is Me'etz HaChaim, the third is Etz HaChaim, and then in Mishlei there's Etz Chaim, Ve'etz Chaim, Etz Chaim. Exactly the way it's written, all of those 7 times equals exactly 1663.
Even further miraculous alignments via letters infused with numbers serving as mathematical devices completely aligns the book of Isaiah chapter 19 verses 19 and 20 with the Great Pyramid itself, as every letter equates out to 5,449, which is ultimately the height in pyramid inches up to the capstone summit of the Great Pyramid. This trait of perfect precision is a unique signature as to the gematria being original to the Hebrews, and what was ultimately an imitation of gematria by the Babylonians called Aru is renowned to have not been able to be the origin of gematria, as it assigned values to whole words arbitrarily. In other words, the values were just made up for whatever reasons and alignments there were in the moment. Moreover, this degree of intimate knowledge of the pyramid is further proof of it indeed being architected by Enoch. Further proof of the pyramids being architected by biblical patriarchs, as well as the original Hebrew being the original script of the human being, found throughout my sharings, such as this one here. So now that it has been made clear that there are numerous books, let alone passages, considered to be poetry by scholars, we see now that either once more this character here was either completely ignorant to this or just desperately trying to run.
Did you know that there are among the Dead Sea Scrolls scrolls that are not biblical, like poems and stuff?
This is what I mean when you state non-biblical. This is why I mentioned the Roman Catholic Church earlier. Are you speaking about what Rome decided to canonize as scripture?
Randy, I asked a very simple question. Are you familiar that there are scrolls among the Dead Sea Scrolls found that have nothing to do with the Bible, that are simply secular, poetic scrolls and writings and letters that have nothing to do with the Bible? Are you aware of that?
Hold on, I just want to clarify. What do you mean by letters?
I'm gonna go ahead and move on.
I don't run from this.
Now to begin, again I asked him, what does he mean by letters? Because as you all just heard, he stated before poems and obviously either had no idea or was completely deceitful and literally trying to present himself as if he didn't know that the Bible has poetic structures and indeed poems all throughout it, as we just saw. So here, ultimately, I don't have to figure out if he's ultimately just ignorant or a liar. Either way, him and any other stand absolutely no chance against the truth. So here once again, I asked him, what does he mean by letters? Especially because a lot of what he considers biblical is made up of letters by those who were nowhere near in line with the truth, as we're about to see more of here shortly. And before we go through authenticating that the Book of Jubilees was indeed authoritative to those actual Hebrews whom preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls, first we will go back to the first point that I brought up.
And particularly to begin, in regards to God not being a man or anything of that nature, Rome actually had the custom of deifying people such as they did Vespasian after his death, and also Titus after his death, shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And about 30 years later after that, you have the first mentions of a Roman Catholic Church. So I first wanted to bring that up to you to see if you see any connection there whatsoever, that here you have these two people who were deified by Rome after their deaths, and then you have the first mentions of a Catholic Church by Ignatius circa 30 years later.
No.
Though not saying everyone must be a scholar to speak with me, it would appear that scholars whose focus is indeed to bring light to the meanings of the biblical books, even with regards to the quote New Testament, indeed also see the very same connection and further evidence as to Rome ultimately trying to hijack what it thought the strengths of Israel were and combining it with its own pagan customs to slowly come out with the Romanized religion that this person here in this sharing and others like him are trying to defend.
Before we talk about Paul, maybe let's look at the bigger picture, like the impact of Rome on the New Testament.
Okay.
So obviously it's a huge topic because the New Testament was written in the Roman world. So there must have been an impact, no? Michael Peppard has written a very interesting book on the notion of the Son of God in the Roman world. On the Gospel of Mark. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, where he argues that the Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as the adopted Son of God in a way that parallels or imitates and at the same time challenges the notion of the emperor as the adopted son of a god, or more exactly of a deified person, because originally emperors became gods only once they were dead. Against the three main Jewish revolts against Rome, 66-73, and then the diaspora revolt, 115 or maybe 16 to 117, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136. And these had tremendous consequences for the Jews, which we need to mention. What happens? The first revolt, the temple is destroyed. Jerusalem is nearly destroyed. I mean, it is devastated. And the temple is destroyed, and it will never be rebuilt until now. And it was a deliberate political decision of Vespasian and continued by his successors. Vespasian ordered that the Jewish temple in Leontopolis in Egypt be destroyed as well. He didn't want any Jewish temple to stand because he had understood probably the religious dimension of the revolt. Another consequence, the tax of the half shekel, which used to fund the cult of the Jerusalem temple was redirected to Rome to fund probably the reconstruction of the temple of Jupiter, the Capitoline temple of Jupiter in Rome, and then probably other temples afterwards. So this must have been very shocking for Jews, that the money that were used for God's temple in Jerusalem now served the temples of the pagan gods of Rome in Rome. Then the sacred vessels that used to be in the Jerusalem temple were carried to Rome. You can still see, the beautiful relief on the Arch of Titus on the Roman Forum. You can see the utensils brought from Jerusalem and carried in a procession during Titus and Vespasian's triumph in the streets of Rome. Now, these utensils, so the trumpets and the table and everything, they were carried and led in the newly built temple to the goddess Peace, Pax. And this was Vespasian's decision. He had this temple specially built in 75. And this is where the utensils from the Jerusalem temple ended, except for the Torah, which apparently was in his palace, the Torah scrolls. And it continues. Then with the last revolt, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, this is the main cause of the revolt. I mean, there are some debates among scholars, but I think the main cause of the revolt was Adrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony. And this was the end of the process. Like, already the temple had been destroyed, the utensils had been brought to Rome, everything was redirected to Rome, and now even the city itself was replaced by a Roman city. And you understand why I said earlier that some Jews could feel that Rome was trying to substitute itself to Israel, not only symbolically, but even physically, with Aelia Capitolina, the Roman colony established where Jerusalem once stood. Like, it's a complete erasure. Israel's bravery and military prowess is celebrated. And you feel that you can feel that even in that respect, they have a kind of feeling of rivalry with Rome. And they say, no, we are really great fighters, and we've had great military victories in our history, even more than you, and we are even more courageous, and so and so. So the ethos of strength and of military valor remains present in the writings of the Jews who were living in the Roman Empire, but together, I mean, mixed with another reaction, which is the emphasis on spiritual strength, intellectual strength, etc. The Romans claim to be the most pious people on earth. And this is something that we see even in Greek inscriptions already in the 2nd century BCE, that, wow, the Greeks themselves were struck by this Roman claim. Like, the Greeks could say, we are philosophers, we are the most clever, but they didn't say we are the most pious. This was really typically Roman. But from a Jewish perspective, who is the most pious people on earth? It is Israel. So, wow, how strange. So we have another people who claims to be the most pious people on earth. Now, if you look at what the Romans considered to be another characteristic of Rome, it was the fact of having the best laws ever written, the best legislation. Like, the Romans considered that they were geniuses in legal issues, not in philosophy, not in the arts. Okay, they acknowledged that the Greeks were better than them, but for legal matters, that was the Roman thing. Now, again, if you think of Israel, what is Israel's, what are they supposed to be proud of? And this takes us back to Deuteronomy.
God's law.
God's law. I mean, we have the best law. There is no question in this realm. We are absolutely the best. This is the wisest law. It's God-given, etc., etc. And then, if you read Virgil, the Aeneid, you will see how, especially at the end of the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, the Romans had this kind of vision, epic vision of being the faraway descendants of Aeneas in some way, and of having been elected by the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon from the beginning of history, to become this very powerful nation which would rule over all the earth, basically, all the civilized world. So there was this feeling of having been chosen by the gods for this historical mission. And this historical mission also did imply ruling other nations, but also bringing peace. Everybody has heard about the Pax Romana, so the Roman peace that would be given and spread all over the world. Now, if you think about traditional Jewish messianic ideas, and if you look already in the book of Isaiah and then in later writings and up to rabbinic texts, if you look at the eschatological scenarios, you see that, well, in the end, Israel and the Messiah with God is supposed to rule over the nations. The nations will bring their wealth to Jerusalem, and there will be universal peace, but from Jerusalem, not from Rome.
Now, here we're going to go back to addressing the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance ultimately. It is widely held that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a sect called by some the Essenes, also known by the Ebionim, Ebion, or Ebionites in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Within the book of the historian Josephus, called The Wars of the Jews, Josephus makes clear that though there are 3 sects, he refers to only one of them, the Essenes, as Jews by birth, Judeans by birth. And though of course not only will you read of angels joining the children of Israel since coming out of Egypt, let alone we are all of Adam and Eve, yet and still in this time period, these scrolls were actually written by those whom were literally descendants of Israel on the way back to Adam and Eve.
I believe in the exact same holding as those that preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls.
You said that you line up with the scrolls that are found at the Dead Sea?
Correct.
So just in case it isn't clear, we're going to hear a little bit more of the caliber of those whom actually preserved and protected the scrolls, and then get into further authenticating the fragment which I brought up, and then see if these actual Hebrews actually believed the type of nonsense these kids are trying to uphold today, as I stated earlier.
That's still trying to twist the interpretations to fit in a Christology which none of those Hebrews actually believed in.
And once more, to begin, whom were those Hebrews?
For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. The followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second the Sadducees, and the third sect, which pretends to a severer discipline, are called Essenes. These last are Jews by birth, and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have.
People who wrote these scrolls knew the Bible better than almost anyone on earth today. These were the scholars of their day, the most brilliant.
Very educated, legal scholars, very committed to a way of life that involved a certain amount of community. They talk about themselves as the Yahad, which really means the union.
And this stream of Judaism is quite an important one. And I think the Christians in the West will learn from this that the real roots of their faith are out here in this desert with these people who are very serious about the Word of God and the promises of God and the prophecies and so on. And we're not interested at all in Greco-Roman philosophy and secular culture.
The church went a certain direction and made a man God.
This is, I have said, the literature of the opposition movement in the Second Temple period. Opposition in the time of the coming of the Herodians and the Romans, which is in the mid-1st century BC. If you want the truth about this period firsthand, go to the scrolls. Now the problem is that the Gospels are advertised as being first-hand eyewitness accounts of this period. I don't think those documents are the nature of first-hand eyewitness accounts. And I don't think there was a peaceful, mystery, mythologized figure who walks on waters, who raises the dead, this highly mythologized figure we call Jesus. Now I would set that aside and say that is overseas literature. That's not borne out by the Palestinian literature. I would say this is the Palestinian literature. This is the nitty-gritty of what really was happening in the Palestinian milieu in the 1st century BC, 1st century AD period.
A militant Jesus, more in the mold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, those not accommodating, challenging the priests and their Roman masters. What do we know about the historic Jesus? Do the Gospels get the facts about him right?
What do we get in the scripture we're familiar with for overseas? Very good proselytation documents, but largely in the interest of the Pax Romanum, and often the very reverse of everything we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
The Gospels are not historical documents, so that doesn't impress me at all. Proselytation documents, but largely in the interest of the Pax Romanum, and often the very reverse of everything we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And often the very reverse of everything we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. To teach straying from the law, to remove the boundary markers which the forefathers, the ancestor, had set down to lead people astray and attract this waste, and to have denied the law in the midst of the whole community. Well, nothing could be a better description of what Paul does in both the Jerusalem Conference in the book of Acts and in his writings.
The book of Acts was written around a basic, undeniable fact. James had assumed leadership of the movement.
Paul considered as the liar? The Gospels narrate how Paul, sent by the high priest to arrest followers of Jesus, is converted by a blinding vision on the road to Damascus, Syria.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls, Damascus is used as a code name for the region where the wilderness camps are located.
Has been proposed by some scholars is that Damascus here was a district within the Roman administrative system, and so that what you have in the word Damascus is simply another term for the Qumran region.
And the New Testament holds that Paul, on his way to that very same region, threatening those who were of the way on the way to Damascus, as we just heard, Qumran. And as it has been shared by the scholar Robert Eisenman, the Essenes, those who preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, also referred to as the Ebionim, the Ebion, or the Ebionites, were known as followers of the Way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.
And even further evidence that these actual Hebrews were completely against the teachings of Paul are his remarks with regards to the diet, which commemorates Genesis 1:29, upheld by the Ebionites.
Later on in the same letter, he says, there are no forbidden things. Eat anything in the butcher shops. He also says some of these people in Romans, in the other letter, are so weak that they'll only eat vegetables. So this is how he talks about this. And
though only to ultimately be contradicted by others, there is one who went as far as to stating that the Ebionites purposely altered records with regards to diet, only to be further contradicted. As you see here, not only is the word in Greek for locust, easily misplaced for the word for pancake or a honey cake when written in Greek. Once more, of course, you're welcome to either pause or screenshot this information. And hear further accounts of vegetarianism as renowned with the Ebionites. And by the grace of God, YHVH, VAVH, as time continues to reveal the differences between the Roman pretenders and the actual Hebrews whom wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, renowned as the Essenes, also known as the Ebionites, the Ebionim, within the scrolls themselves, as what was actually believed by the actual Hebrews is continuously revealed, and thus so concerning to those who initially oversaw the scrolls.
He was a churchman. His name was Roland DeVoe. He was the head of the Dominican order in Palestine. He wore 2 hats. He also was head of a school of French Vatican archaeology known as the École Biblique. So he developed what he called an international committee. It was only international in name only, because first of all it was always Judenrein, that is, no Jew could ever be part of this committee. So it was a fiction of an international committee, but on the whole it was dominated by churchmen. For the few non-church or Protestant scholars that were part of this committee, there was always more cleric-type monastic individuals who were part of this committee. That is, the principal people were Father DeVoe himself, a man called Father Milik, another man called Father Starkey, and in the present generation they have been succeeded by a father called Emile Puech. He is the reigning Dominican father at the present time.
As they call it, this little club of theirs.
The monopoly of the few was blown up by another scandal. In an interview, research leader Professor John Strugnell, an ardent Catholic, called Judaism a horrible religion that was originally racist, a Christian heresy that should never have survived. Strugnell was sacked. Israeli authorities opened the study of the scroll to all of science, and complete publication on microfiche was prepared. It had already been preceded by activist scholars who pried open the old monopoly with pirate editions from photographs.
As long as you had a monopoly, you had official interpretation. The official interpretation was the official theory, the Essene theory. Now we're going to the interpretation of the scrolls.
Now it's all available. Since it's all available, it changed everything. And I think what you're seeing now is a totally new, almost refoundation of the field of Dead Sea Scrolls studies.
Now we can get to the battle of the interpretation of the scrolls. This is where the battle is joined.
If you recall, the chief editor was removed just not too many months ago.
I read about that.
For making statements that Judaism was a fossilized religion. It should have disappeared long ago, and so forth.
Not very familiar with the Bible, is he?
And even Father DeVoe was pretty well outspoken as a person who would never set foot in Israeli territory or deal with Israelis in any way. So that's part of the story.
How can people, by logic, be chosen who are against the people who wrote the scrolls?
Because the church went a certain direction and made a man God.
And particularly to begin, in regards to God not being a man or anything of that nature, Rome actually had the custom of deifying people such as they did Vespasian after his death, and also Titus after his death, shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And about 30 years later after that, you have the first mentions of a Roman Catholic Church.
I don't know if you're familiar with this book, where he argues that the Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as the adopted Son of God in a way that parallels or imitates and at the same time challenges the notion of the emperor as the adopted son of a god, or more exactly of a deified person, because originally emperors became gods only once they were dead. So they were not gods, they were deified persons after their death. So this is his argument. In that case, for example, I'm not convinced that this was really that significant, because we have a very strong and well-established tradition concerning the Messiah, who is the Son of God, or concerning the King first in the Hebrew Bible, and then the Messiah. We have a very interesting text from Qumran, the Aramaic Apocalypse, 4Q 246, that mentions the Messiah as the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. So I think that on this issue, Jesus as Son of God, I think it really has to be understood within the Jewish framework as a whole, not so much as a response to the title of the emperor as son of a deified person. I think it makes much more sense in the Jewish tradition than in the Roman one.
And as the scrolls reflect what the actual Hebrews, known as the Essenes, or the Ebionites, and as the scrolls that were written reflect what was actually thought, believed, and upheld throughout whatever conflict, as once more these scrolls were preserved and protected, and these records, along with the Ketif Hinnom silver scrolls, are the oldest fragments of the Hebrew Bible in the world. With these scrolls being preserved and protected by these Hebrews, also known as Essenes or Ebionites, these fragments serving as a window into or a bridge back to what exactly these actual Hebrews understood or believed, which is being debated today. And as you saw and are seeing here, some of these fragments, such as the silver scrolls, date back to the late 7th to early 6th century BCE, with the Dead Sea Scrolls having date ranges from the 5th century BCE to the 1st century CE. So now we will delve deeper into what the scrolls reflect was actually upheld and believed by the actual Hebrews that preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls when it comes to a messianic profile, beginning with Jeremiah chapter 33 verse 17, as demonstrated since Genesis, being contrary to a virgin birth.
They had to be a son of David in order to qualify as the Messiah. And it goes on to say,
the Bible even specifies that Messiah, when he comes, whoever he may be, must be out of the family of David.
That's right. And the people knew that.
Sure.
Okay. So anyone they would describe as a Messiah had to qualify in that way.
Now here are some excerpts of a past debate addressing exactly this. Romans chapter 1 verse 3, it states that the Son of God was born of the seed of David. So any trying to interpret Mary coming from Nathan, David's son, would completely contradict Genesis 38 verse 9, when a son of Judah was punished for spilling his seed on the ground. So with that being said, when actually delving into messianic profiles, starting with the Torah through the Tanakh, you must first address the resurrection in Ezekiel chapter 37, which is very clearly a prophecy placed in metaphor for the future, as in the text it describes it as if it is happening at that very time and place, yet it was still prophecy to be fulfilled. So finally, in showing that the resurrection proposed in this person's criteria was completely flawed, is the fact that if one resurrected, where is he? Trying to say something along the lines of he's in spirit form in heaven at the right hand of the Father is complete contradiction to Jeremiah 33:17. Now we're going to return to the excerpts here in a moment to display how the scrolls are actually aligned with the messianic profile which has been preserved throughout Judaism by rabbis. The messianic profile that you are about to hear of, in essence, the Messiah being a first single example of the coming together of the stick of Judah and of the stick of Joseph, is further solidified by what is held as the Son of God scroll amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which in sequential order first speaks of the coming of the Son of God and then the rise of the people of God.
There could be only one. Just one, not two. So we hope and we pray and we believe that these two figures can actually be united in one person. Very important prophecy of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, is the prophecy of the two sticks. That one stick is the stick of Joseph and the other is the stick of David, and he puts them together and they become one stick.
So what evidence is there specifically that I would fit the messianic profile of the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph, particularly through Ephraim, who was the younger son given the firstborn blessing, just as Jacob was with Esau? Here you are seeing epigraphic evidence to what is called the Hebraic Indian theory. And though the term Indian may set off stereotypical imagery in your head post-Columbus, this would apply to one side of my family. And though we are about to move to heavier proof that I am indeed the Mashiach, without even needing to engage subject matters such as those who believe the tribe of Ephraim is on a specific island, down to this detail, this epigraphic evidence, let alone ongoing archaeological studies on artifacts of such islands and land masses, further prove the legitimacy of me fitting this messianic profile. And on my father's side, it was shared with me that we had family in Holland, in line with, quote, Santa Claus bringing slaves on ships, what is renowned as the Messianic Apocalypse scroll, which describes the expected work of a Messiah, reads not just of healing and curing, but bringing it back full circle to Ezekiel chapter 37, a resurrection. This is the manner of truth which concerned those whom were against the Hebrews. Further proof as to me being the actual Mashiach is found within this video here, as well as throughout my sharings. Now that it is further substantiated that the actual Hebrews, which preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls, did not believe in any virgin birth, nor in the resurrection that was described in the so-called New Testament. So now placing a seal on that segment of this sharing, here soon I'm going to substantiate the fragment that I brought up and the book of Jubilees as held in the Dead Sea Scrolls as being authoritative, right after beginning to address this statement.
There are scrolls among the Dead Sea Scrolls found that have nothing to do with the Bible, that are simply secular, poetic scrolls and writings and letters that have nothing to do with the Bible. Are you aware of that?
Now it has been brought forward that one of the fragments found amongst the scrolls that some would have considered strictly poetic amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly fragment 33 of scroll 4Q381, is the actual prayer which is mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, beginning with verse 18. Presented by William Schniedelwind, along with the scroll being titled The Prayer of Manasseh within its very own text. Here are some of the observations which authenticate this being the actual prayer of Manasseh, yet making all the more clear that one must be careful when they're speaking of the scrolls amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, written by actual Hebrews and their relation to the Bible.
There are scrolls among the Dead Sea Scrolls found that have nothing to do with the Bible, that are simply secular, poetic scrolls and writings and letters that have nothing to do with the Bible. Are you aware of that?
As once more, here we have a fragment that many would have considered secular poetry, which there is evidence directly appears to be the actual prayer of Manasseh mentioned in the Bible. Once more, the fragment itself is titled The Prayer of Manasseh, as you will see that, as well as other parallels to a known translation here. As once more, here we have a fragment that many would have considered secular poetry, which there is evidence directly appears as the actual prayer of Manasseh mentioned in the Bible. And here we'll delve a little deeper as to why one should be a little more careful when considering how the scrolls relate to the Bible, let alone when there is a book in the New Testament, Jude, which he considers a part of the Bible, which directly quotes Enoch, which is found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls and not considered canon by whatever standards he's going by today, and shows all the more how important the scrolls found at Qumran, and what the Essenes, the Ebionites, the Hebrews, and many Judeans by birth actually considered authoritative. Further reasons as to that are these parallels between what is called the Book of Matthew of the New Testament and the community rule amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with further history recorded about the Essenes. The age of the community rule scroll, in comparison to that of the quote Book of Matthew, along with what is recorded in Josephus's book, The Jewish War, shows all the more that it was indeed the Essenes, the Ebionites, the Ebionim, the actual Hebrews, whom were indeed authoritative, not any later New Testament stray from the way.
What we call the community's text that's from this believing community would be kind of like we would say a New Testament.
The actual Hebrews, whom were indeed authoritative, not any later New Testament stray from the way.
For travel document. And in that document, Paul goes for his last visit up to Jerusalem to meet James, and James is not introduced. It's assumed we know who he is, but he never had been introduced in Acts previously. And the other James that most people think it is has already been executed in Acts previously. So we have no idea who this James is, but he's the leader of the early church. And he goes in to see James. So it's clearly James, the brother of Jesus. And James then says to Paul, it says that, everyone was greeted Paul enthusiastically and so on. And then James seems to speak and says, but you see, Paul, we are all here zealots for the law. And we hear that you have been teaching overseas against the people, against the temple, and against the law. I didn't even know there was a guy called James when I started all of this. And when I was reading the book of Acts, it jumped out at me. Who is this person, Particularly in the we portion of Acts, the later portion, he becomes very important. And you realize he's the leader of the early church, if you read it carefully. And then Paul is in conflict with him.
In Acts 15, James stands up and says, my decision is, and he dictates a letter that is sent to all the churches, presumably worldwide. So he's the, people today say the Pope, he's the Bishop of Jerusalem, he's head of the church, not Peter. Peter speaks, but James stands up. After this, James replied, my decision is. Here is Acts 21. Paul is coming up to Jerusalem years later, and he goes in first thing to see James and the elders. As he goes to the headquarters, he goes to see James. My guess is they're probably meeting on Mount Zion in the little building that we've talked about, where I think the family lived, Mary and the kids. And essentially, James and is in charge, and he questions Paul about, are you teaching Jews? We decided Gentiles don't have to keep the Torah, but of course, Jews have to keep the Torah, even if they're Christian, right? Paul didn't answer. He didn't go, oh. But in his letters, he says, well, to the Jew, I become as a Jew, though I'm not really under the law, 1 Corinthians 9. And to the non-Jews, I become as though I'm not a Jew. And he rebukes Peter for following that and then going back on it when James shows up. And there's a whole split in the movement later that's reflected in the Judeo-Christian writings called the Pseudo-Clementines, who see Paul as an apostate from the law. They're later called the Ebionites.
So now that it is all the more clear that it was those whom wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, the actual Hebrews, known as the Essenes, the Ebionites, the Ebionim, within the scrolls themselves, which upheld historical facts and traditions which the foundations of ultimately came from Adam and Eve. So no matter where it is that you find yourself in this God-given world, whether it be what is called Rome or anywhere else, if anybody tells you a man was God itself, Yahweh, you now know that is incorrect, completely false.
The church went a certain direction and made a man God.
Just to put it very plainly, things obviously are not going to go well for those whom are opposed to those whom are the daughters and sons of light, ultimately of the way of God itself.
How can people by logic be chosen who are against the people who wrote the scrolls?
And just as was preserved by the Ebionim, the Ebionites, that David will never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel, Yisrael. A scripture which solidifies that the line of David has always been and still remains a dynasty.
They had to be a son of David in order to qualify as the Messiah. And it goes on to say,
The Bible even specifies that Messiah, when he comes, whoever he may be, must be out of the family of David.
That's right. And the people knew that.
Sure.
Okay.
In this world, there will be a king who will be descended from David HaMelech, who will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and gather the exiles of Israel and create a world of peace again.
And in the parsha, it talks about a king. So you know that when Mashiach comes, we're going to have a whole different system of leadership here in Israel. We're going to have a king. It talks about a king. So I want to tell you the story from the book of Shmuel, from the prophets, from the book of Samuel, about the anointing of a very special king called King David. Anyone ever hear of David HaMelech, the author of Tehillim and the ancestor of Mashiach, the descendant of Rus, right?
The ultimate future is Mashiach. The soul of Mashiach. The ultimate past is Adam. He's the first soul. He's the beginning. He's the first. The last is Mashiach. Who's the middle soul? So the Arizal says that the middle soul, even though he already lived, but he's still continuously alive. His life is going on, and he represents the present. The three souls, the Arizal says, are the initial letters of the word Adam himself, because they're all included within the very first one, Adam. And what does Adam stand for? Adam. It stands for Adam, David, Mashiach. Adam, the very first word, Adam, stands for the beginning of all of history and the middle of all of history, as David, King David, is considered the midpoint of history. And the end is Mashiach. So that is Adam, David, Mashiach. Adam, David, and Mashiach.
This is what the Rambam explained explicitly in Moreh Nebuchim. He says the purpose of the king is to unify the opinions of all of the people of his generation, which is to remove, to nullify all of this static in the air. That is explicitly explained by the Rambam in Moreh Nebuchim. That's why the Halakha said, and the Rambam himself passes at the end of the whole Plagim, that the temple cannot be built without a king. Because a king appears, and then a king fights wars, whether it's physical wars or spiritual wars, but he has some work to do in order to purify all of the nations of the earth, was to be able to come to consensus, and this through the power but also through the goodness of the king. Because the king is a symbol of power, he's also a symbol of ultimate goodness.
The sages say that one of the signs of a true leader is that the crown fits him, fits his head. a person who wants to rule, but he is not intended by God to be the king of the people, the crown will not fit him. There's something in this idiom, this metaphor of the crown fitting the head, that also means that the people who has an observant eye will recognize if the position of kingship fits this particular individual. This is something that a sensitive people has with regard to its potential leader. Does kingdom fit his personality? This even without the concept of charisma that we mentioned previously. Does kingdom fit him? That acknowledgement or realization, recognition that he is fit to be a king is something latent in the essence of the heart of he who is intended to be the people that accepts upon himself the king. So may we find and recognize that individual who kingdom fits him. In Kabbalah, what is Mashiach? But the light that fills our room right now is the light of Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. But Mashiach comes to reveal a new Torah, a new dimension of the Torah.
Now I will substantiate the fragment which I brought up earlier in the book of Jubilees as held within the Dead Sea Scrolls by the Ebionites, the Ebionim, the ancient Hebrews who preserved and protected them. So to begin, we're going to go back to a remark made within the conversation.
I only care about what the actual Bible says, the Hebrew text, the Torah.
There's no consensus on canon in Jesus' day. It wasn't like all the Jews were agreed. In fact, if you look closely, the Sadducees thought only the books of Moses were canonical. Pharisees considered the prophets canonical as well, and the Psalms. And then the Essenes, the Qumran group, was part of the broader movement known as the Essenes. They had this larger canon.
I only care about what the actual Bible says, the Hebrew text, the Torah.
Though we're going to get specific into the Hebrew text very soon. Once more, in other words, those whom consider the New Testament, the Bible, should care then why it is that they cite the book of Enoch, which is a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So now, with a better understanding of who are the Hebrews whom preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls, to further authenticate Jubilees as authoritative and even show evidence as to it being a part of the very Torah, to the actual Hebrews whom preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls.
What did the Qumran evidence show? Well, the Qumran evidence showed that at least one very devout, highly respected Jewish community had a bigger canon than what Jews today and Protestants today use. The Qumranites almost certainly accepted Jubilees as canonical, First Enoch as canonical. They had many, many more copies of Jubilees and First Enoch than most of the books of the Bible. There's many more copies of Jubilees than there are of the 12 prophets, for example. Tobit was very likely considered scriptural. They had 5 copies of that, which is more than, say, of Ezra, of 1st and 2nd Kings, of many other books that we know are canonical. Sirach is a little bit doubtful. They did have a couple of copies of that. And then they had these other documents like the Temple Scroll that nobody else used, but they probably thought were inspired.
If the Essenes were a major legal school, a party of Second Temple Judaism, as they are presented in Philo and in Josephus, you would expect some of their interpretations to be known quite widely. So it could very well be that there is this influence that people know Essene understandings of things or texts that the Essenes particularly value, like Jubilees.
Struck me as a fascinating example of how people were reading Genesis and Exodus way back at this time, say 150, 160 years before the birth of Christ. And then God says to an angel of the presence, an angel who serves right in God's presence, you dictate to Moses from heavenly tablets. So this angel has to just read to Moses from the heavenly tablets all the stuff that's found in the rest of the book. And the rest of the book looks a lot like Genesis and the first half of Exodus. It starts with a story of creation, and it continues with Adam and Eve, and then going on to the flood, and then to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is especially an important person in this book, and on into the stories of Moses. I think it makes best sense to say it was written before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that the Dead Sea Scroll community thought very highly of the Book of Jubilees, had a bunch of copies of it around, and used it, cited it in some of their documents.
Yeah, I was reading in I think it was you who wrote it, that was talking about how they might or probably thought it was inspired. Like it was one text that like essentially put it along with the Torah, I guess. I think it was.
Well, there's an important document among the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Damascus document by people today, and it cites Jubilees, and it refers to the Torah of Moses, and then it uses a title for Jubilees, the book of the divisions of the times and weeks, and it talks about both of them in the same way, that things are exactly stated in both of them, about legal matters and so on. And it gives you the impression that Jubilees and the Torah of Moses are like each other, being put on somewhat of the same level, it seems like. We also have a reference or two to something from Jubilees that's introduced by a formula, like it is written. And, in the New Testament, for example, that's a way of citing stuff from the Old Testament. It is written, or it stands written that, and then something from the Old Testament will be quoted. Well, Jubilees is referred to in that way a time or two in the scrolls, again suggesting it's written there, so it must be right, is the implication. So they thought very highly of it, I think, probably accepted the claims the book makes for itself.
Wow. But then we do not have as much acceptance of it, right? Like, it's like one specific Christian church or something like that, or area?
Yeah. Maybe this community of the Dead Sea Scrolls regarded it as authoritative. I think it's likely they did. But we don't know of other Jewish groups who did. We do know that some Christians thought highly of it, some early Christians, and used it, could cite it in support of their positions. There's certainly appreciation for it in Christianity. And one of the uses to which early Christians put it was to kind of fill in the gaps in Genesis and Exodus, where Jubilees has something more than Genesis or Exodus. Christians would take stuff from Jubilees and put it in there. We have some copies of Genesis, for example, that have kind of notes in the margins of Greek manuscripts, and stuff from Jubilees gets quoted there, explaining a couple of passages in Genesis. But eventually Jubilees, which seems to have been translated in Greek, even though we don't have any copies of it, was translated from Greek into the Ethiopic language that I was talking about earlier. And in the Ethiopic Christian church, the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, it was accepted as part of the Old Testament. Jubilees has Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob obeying a lot of laws that we know only from the law of Moses. The laws that were revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai and afterwards. According to the author, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob already obeyed and knew many of these laws. And so we get in Jubilees a tradition, apparently going all the way back to Adam, that God progressively reveals his laws, to these patriarchs. And they write them down and pass the books in which they write them down to the next generation.
Even today, the Book of Jubilees is indeed considered canonical by the Ethiopian Jews and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as well, and highlighting all the more what was brought up by both Joan Taylor and also James Vanderkam, that ultimately the Book of Jubilees was used to gain further insight and understanding, as well as cited when it comes to the subject matters pertaining to books such as Genesis and Exodus.
You would expect some of their interpretations to be known quite widely. So it could very well be that there is this influence, that people know Essene understandings of things or texts that the Essenes particularly value, like Jubilees.
We do know that some Christians thought highly of it, some early Christians, and used it, could cite it in support of their positions.
And showing just how authentically authoritative the Book of Jubilees truly is. As you are seeing here, the same quote church father whom called the Ebionites liars for setting the record straight, for bringing truth to a matter, ultimately had to quote from the very same book which was preserved by those Hebrews. Once more, showing just how important, let alone respected, the Book of Jubilees truly was, not just to the actual Hebrews whom preserved and protected it, as well as the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even the so-called church fathers whom were opposed to this truth. And by the grace of God, as time reveals all, it only becomes all the more clear what was the truth all along. And now to take this even further.
I only care about what the actual Bible says, the Hebrew text, the Torah.
When it comes to what the actual Bible says, the Hebrew text, the Torah, if he could ask his quote church father, Jerome, what he would do when it comes to such a thing, well, according to his own actions, he would direct him over to Jubilees, or as sometimes Jubilees has been called, Little Genesis. So now that it is all the more clear that there is a huge difference between Greco-Roman fabrications once upon a time and what has been upheld by actual Hebrews passed down since Adam and Eve. And just as shared by the angel, scholar, and Krebs, for Jerome, consulting biblical text in Hebrew was to reach back to a fountain of truth that would unlock the real meaning of Scripture. So with these clarifications now in place, we're going to go back to our conversation and all the more put an end to anything which is against the truth of Yud-He, Vav-He.
A few things here, Angel. The first thing is that You just mentioned to me that the quote mighty God you were waiting on was to be born once, and then we're talking about different angels, such as he who wrestled with Jacob, which of course was a human being such as you and I. You'll see throughout the text, such as in Genesis 18, there were 3 men that visited Abraham, and then in chapter 19, in the first verse, they're introduced as angels. And according to the Jubilees creation,
only 2 of them are introduced as angels.
That's correct. But according to the Jubilees creation fragment 4Q216, you will see very clearly that, of course, angel means messenger, but in the way that it is commonly placed, you will see that throughout creation, such as let us make man in our image, it's God actually speaking to us in angel form. Again, that's fragment 4Q216, which again supports the fact that there are actual... Go ahead.
That's false. The scripture doesn't say that.
Which scripture are you referring to?
I'm talking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It doesn't say that. There's no Hebrew text that says that God is speaking to humans when he's making humans.
So now, very simply, we are going to review the exact same Hebrew text, being Jubilees, that even Jerome went to for clarification when it comes to the time span of Genesis, of course outside of Genesis. Now we will get back to day 6, the 6th phase of creation, and whom it is that God was speaking to when it stated, let us make man in our image. But first we will begin with day phase 1. As you see here, recorded in the book of Jubilees, on day 1, God created its angels. And then it goes on, and thereupon we saw its works and praised it and lauded before it on account of all of its works. For 7 great works it created on the first day. And once more, Jubilees is stating that we saw its works on the first day. Now I'm about to clarify all the more what exactly it is that means, and the fact that you are witnessing the end of a war, as we are about to go over what it is that pagan pretenders ultimately did not want you to know.
How can people by logic be chosen who are against the people who wrote the scrolls? And the literature we have that has come back to haunt us all is the scrolls.
Now the twisted, Romanized view of creation was that the Most High God created everything through their made-up pretender to my line.
Or he talks about how, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? You know, talking about Yahweh. We know the Son laid the foundation of the earth according to Hebrews 1. So it's kind of interesting how it makes a distinction between Jesus and the angels.
Wait, here
it's amazing how all the sons of God cannot be compared to Jehovah, but yet Christ is exactly like Jehovah.
Compared to Jehovah. Mm-hmm.
Sitting on high with him, not below him. Notice on the right hand, it should say like sitting above him, right?
It should.
How completely pitiful actual paganism gets. Now these children once thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls were in their favor, that it supported their nonsense.
Do you know what Isaiah is?
Yeah, we read about Isaiah.
Okay, that's Prophet Isaiah. Do you know who the Psalms are by?
Come
on. Your Quran says it.
David.
Thank you. There you go. David. Do you know who the Torah was given to?
Yeah, obviously Moses, yeah.
Obviously Moses.
I think it was you who wrote it that was talking about how they might or probably thought it was inspired. Like it was one text that like essentially put it along with the Torah, I guess. I think it was.
Yes. Well, there's an important document among the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Damascus document by people today, and it cites Jubilees, and it refers to the Torah of Moses, and then it uses a title for Jubilees, the book of the divisions of the times and weeks. And it talks about both of them in the same way, that things are exactly stated in both of them, about legal matters and so on. And it gives you the impression that Jubilees and the Torah of Moses are like each other, being put on somewhat of the same level, it seems like.
Not only keep in mind, as we are reminded by the angel Malizan, that the Torah can pertain to more than what is renowned as the 5 books of Moses. And as Moses was writing down the instruction, the law, and the history on Mount Sinai, why it can be referenced as Torah Mount Sinai.
Do you know who the Torah was given to?
Yeah, obviously Moses, yeah.
Obviously Moses.
God says to an angel of the presence, an angel who serves right in God's presence, you dictate to Moses from heavenly tablets. So this angel has to just read to Moses from the heavenly tablets all the stuff that's found in the rest of the book. And the rest of the book looks a lot like Genesis and the first half of Exodus.
And as a Jubilees fragment confirms that the angel of the presence is the angel of the Lord, whom was in front of the Israelite camp, and of course being an angel of the Lord is not God itself.
So we have the Torah, the Psalms, then the writings of all the prophets in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they foretell the crucifixion and suffering of the Messiah.
And in further showing that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not support this person's belief, but indeed support Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 17, that there will always be a man from the house of David to sit on the throne of Israel. There have been scholars that have interpreted multiple messiahs through their studies of the scrolls, predating whom he claimed to be the Messiah. We will get deeper into that subject matter in the near future.
These are prophets saying these things. What is the explanation for these scrolls that exist almost 200 years before Jesus, describing what happened to him? How is this possible? This is before any biased Christian can get a hold of them. This is before any biased Christian can go in and try to corrupt them. Before any of that is possible, we have these scripts that exist before these guys that tell us exactly what happened to Jesus before he's born. How? I need an explanation.
That's still trying to twist the interpretations to fit in a Christology which none of those Hebrews actually believed in.
Struck me as a fascinating example of how people were reading Genesis and Exodus way back at this time, say 150, 160 years before the birth of Christ. I think it makes best sense to say it was written before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that the Dead Sea Scroll community thought very highly of the book.
And you will not find a shortage of scholars which agree that the Book of Jubilees itself predates the writing of scrolls at Qumran. As ultimately, when you read the book itself,
you will see that it is preserving history and information passed down since Adam and Eve, as clear with Noah speaking to his sons in the first person, let alone the keeping of the calendar since Adam passed down, and there being 50 jubilees upon entering the promised land, which I have demonstrated previously fits perfectly with an overall historical and biblical chronology. Now we will return to the Jubilees fragment 4Q216 and analysis of other Dead Sea Scroll fragments, which further proves that not only was God speaking to its angels throughout creation, but that we are indeed those angels previous to being in the flesh. We will begin with the work by the angel Matthew P. Monger, whom also states in his own words that a fixed canon during these times of antiquity is not likely, and that the very same chapter contained within this manuscript was also used by Epiphanius, whose work also aligns with Dead Sea Scroll fragments, such as the Hymn to the Creator.
The fragment 4Q216 aligns with those 6 days of creation, showing that God was indeed speaking to us in angel form.
So it's not Genesis, right?
It is indeed in Genesis throughout the days of creation, like when it states, "Let us make man."
Lenny, I'm asking a direct question.
What was that?
Does Genesis 1:26 say that God is talking to mankind as he's creating mankind?
No, what I stated was the Jubilees creation fragment 4Q216 makes that clear.
That not only was God speaking to its angels throughout the days of creation, just as in Genesis 1:26, which aligns with the Jubilees fragment, but also, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, that we are indeed those angels prior to coming into the flesh. Scholarly analysis on Genesis 1:26, referring to God's angels as its heavenly court, align with the Jubilees fragment along with other Dead Sea Scrolls that indeed Yahweh itself created the heavens and the earth, let alone all of the creations within it. So here we see clearly that along with separate scholarly analysis as those shown here, when it comes to Genesis 1:26 and God clearly speaking to its heavenly court, which is its angels, and that the very Dead Sea Scrolls not only supports that God was speaking to its angels in Genesis 1:26, but that Yahweh itself created the heavens and the earth. This proving all the more that the ancient Hebrews, which preserved and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls, did not hold to a Romanized view of creation. And now we will begin to conclude with further proof that it was indeed known that we are Yahweh's angels. Going back to Matthew P. Monger's work, he writes, Jubilees describes angels in quite human terms, with the example here able to get deeper as to circumcision of the heart. Now the work on this fragment demonstrates that the angels witnessed God, Yud-He, Vav-He, creating the heavens and the earth, which is consistent across the scrolls. It is clearly connected to the time frame of Genesis 1:26 and clarifies that God was speaking to its angels, as is the case within the book of Job when God was laying the foundations of the earth prior to the creation of the flesh. Matthew also notes that Jubilees describes angels in human terms and presents a translation of humanity being now in the flesh, since the first Adam being formed according to the likeness of angels. Matthew goes on to in essence recommend scholar Benjamin Wold with regards to the information that he has published when it comes to how the Hebrews at Qumran viewed angels. And he also goes over studies of the verses within the scrolls, showing as well that there are verses that state that righteous people were described as angelic priests, and ultimately the entire community with angelic beings. And declarations of being reckoned or counted amongst the angels with a dwelling in the holy council. And the scholar Joseph L. Angel has also seen the parallels between the heavenly and earthly worshippers, and has more works on the subject matter. Also the scholar Carol Newsom, this angel notes in particularly the descriptions of the angelic priests and their vestments. She also goes on to state that the terminology used to describe the organization of the angels is similar to as the Qumran sect applied to itself. The exact same terminology is common throughout the book of Numbers in describing the organization of Israel in the wilderness, as the scrolls reflect that militaristic terms and structures were a part of the culture of the ancient Hebrews, as we see Yahweh of armies, Yahweh, the God of armies, etched throughout the Bible. Once more, as we saw earlier, within the Dead Sea Scrolls, in particularly the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, there is a description of the vestments, the garments of the angelic high priest. Carol brings forward the parallels between the book of Exodus and the description of these garments, including the ephod. In a work by David Larson called Angels Among Us, he also cites the work of other scholars such as James R. Davila and Crispin Fletcher Lewis, which further support Crispin's thoughts that the angels described in the text are exalted high priests. This is solidified all the more by the work of Judith H. Newman, whom shares that the song for the first Sabbath corresponds with the week the new priests are ordained. And now, after it being all the more clear that the angels described are the priests, humans, and drawing closer to a conclusion, David highlights the significance between the priests in heavenly garments, just as Moses came down from Mount Sinai, clothed in glory, after having spoken with the Lord and having received its law, and with the Israelites upholding teachings and history since Adam and Eve. Direct correlation between Moses being clothed in glory and garments of glory belonging to Adam and Eve is gone over by scholar Andrei Orlov in his work Vested with Adam's Glory, as it is shown that interpretations within the Targum reflect that it was not clothes of animal skin that God gave to Adam and Eve, but clothes, garments of light. As like Psalms 104, it covers itself with light as with a garment. As this work points out the correlation between these garments of light shedding radiance from these garments of glory to Moses' face being glorified after Mount Sinai. And as the Most High God, Yahweh, has orchestrated, just as there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 acts of creation and 22 generations from Adam to Jacob, Israel, Yisrael. And just as those chosen were carrying on what has been passed on since Adam and Eve, it brings all the more realization to Exodus chapter 4, verse 22. Israel is my son, even my firstborn, as once more this history has been passed on, preserved and protected since Adam and Eve. Now, just as Job chapter 38 verse 7 highlights all the more that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God was indeed speaking to its angels, which are indeed us. Here we will now see further proof that not only was this the understanding of the actual Hebrews,
you will see that throughout creation, such as let us make man in our image, it's God actually speaking to us in angel form.
Right now you're an angel inside of a human form.
And it is evident that, quote, church fathers were aware of this information, as Epiphanius, whom they called Christ, was created by God as one of the archangels, according to the Hebrews.
I am the king of the angels, let alone the Israelites. Literally. Obviously, God's the king of us all. Not to make that no one here thinks they're God. Being very clear.
You are an ark and a servant of the light. Put in a human form.
I still sense the new angel spirit is strong in this place.
And it is written by the, quote, church father, Cyril of Jerusalem, that when Christ wished to come upon the earth, the good Father summoned a mighty power in heaven, which was called Michael, and entrusted Christ to the care thereof. And the power came into the world, and it was called Mary.
Gracias a mi vieja que siempre dobló rodillas. Dios mío, que no lo mate, manda un ángel todos los días. Dios, si no le es suficiente, conviérteme en un ángel que yo bajo desde el cielo para proteger su vida.
And it is renowned in the book of Daniel that Daniel was speaking to angels, particularly Gabriel and Michael. Throughout the book, these angels are recorded as men and princes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the terminology used in the book of Daniel, such as one in the likeness of the sons of men, then again in slightly other words, one like the appearance of a man, shows to stem from Genesis, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and Adam having a son in his likeness after his image. In other words, his appearance, which of course extends far beyond just aesthetic. And Church Father Origen writes of our beginnings, our origins, being a spiritual angelic state of intellect that God created, which is written about all the more by scholar Charles Stain. And with our Genesis all the more clarified, we see why there are those whom have been waiting on the true Messiah, Mashiach, Christ.
I believe in Christ, meaning I believe in the coming of the Messiah. That's all Christ means. But I want them to believe in the true Messiah that, please God, will come very, very soon. Now,
and in the book of Micah, it is clear that the ancient Hebrews awaited a Messiah whose ways were from of old, from ancient times. And the Ebionim, renowned for a keeping of strict vegetarian diet and rejecting animal sacrifice, is in clear correlation with the first sacrifice done by Adam and being a non-animal sacrifice. And coming full circle to this holding brings all the more light to Adam being a calendar or clock in acronym form, standing for since Adam to David to Mashiach, Messiah, Christ.
I'm gonna go ahead and move on, bro. Because it's pointless talking to you. You can't answer anything.
Hey, all you got to do at this point, brother, is say, I'm sorry, Lord, that I've been so stubborn.